was history. And this is where I get my title from. He says, this is the very first sentence of the book. History, if viewed as a repository for more than anecdote or chronology, could produce a decisive transformation in an image of science by which we are now possessed. And if you'll notice and look back in Essential Tension, he has a lot to say about science textbooks, how crummy they are, what's terrible about them, what the problem is with science textbooks. What's his problem with science textbooks? I mean, they seem to represent in both texts, actually, the problem he has with the image of science in his day. And what seems to be the issue here?
Well, doesn't he say that science textbooks are problematic because they just show the exact information as has been passed down is the, I guess, the paradigm of the day, and don't actually educate kids on how to sort of develop on that? They just say this is the problem and this is how it was solved, as opposed to how it might be solved in the future, or teach like exploratory things.
Yeah, he says basically presents it. I mean, in the Essential Tension, it's almost a comic presentation, right? Because he says on one hand, the problem with the way you're teaching science is that it has nothing to do with the way science is presently being done. It just presents science as a settled body of information, and that settled body of information is more or less sort of revealed through the process of science as getting things correct. And within that, there's a cumulative development. But within that, what will be the function of history? Essentially nothing, right? History is just the history of people not getting it right until they get it right. So your textbook doesn't even have to present why you would study history or what history is. And it's a comic presentation, even as he says that, which is a pretty scathing judgment, he says, nonetheless, this mode of teaching science has been tremendously productive, right? Which is a sort of an odd turn. He says, even simply in drilling this into people's heads, it forces them to try to match theory to fact in an ever-reducing sort of, try to reduce the distance between the two. And in that, it sort of inadvertently creates a moment of creativity when those two don't match. But basically, he's going to say we need to step back and look at how this has happened in the past, and we'll see the historical development of that, in fact, has been a creative process in itself. And that science textbooks don't show us that, but that's what the process of science has been. And that's why he says at the beginning of the next paragraph, even from history, that new concept will not be forthcoming if historical data continue to be sought and scrutinized, mainly to answer questions posed by the unhistorical stereotype drawn from the science text. Right? And so his goal will be to say, what we need to do is think about this as a historical development. Why would that matter for present science? I mean, if on one hand he's saying, it worked pretty well in the past, actually, to study science, and just, many of you I'm sure have taken science classes, well, this is exactly what you do. You just need to learn all of the basics of organic chemistry or physics in order to get to a certain point. And he's saying that actually works pretty well for what it does, but it actually is really bad for explaining scientific creativity. Why would that be? I mean, what would be missing in this concept? Or what would history do for science in a positive way? Let me put it another way. How does this sort of change the role of the scientist? Yeah?
Would it provide the structure he said was lacking before, when good science can be created, get created out of chaos, but through trial and error? Would looking at history look at errors that have been posed, and then from there, create things?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be a big part of it. I mean, basically, he's going to say, once you know this has happened before, he's going to say, not just as a coincidence, but as a fact, your present science will have gaps, and will have mistakes in it. And when you see the past, you'll be able to see that what counts as reality in 1800 actually had a fully legitimate structure. And this will be a key part of his argument, as I'll turn to in a second. A fully legitimate but different structure. And if you want to make the next big move in science, and this is what makes the book a bestseller among scientists, you need to figure out how these structural transformations occurred. You need to look at the sociology of what happened, what kind of people come up with this, what their role is, what their position is. That's how you get at the creativity of this. But then even more importantly, this is a way of changing what you think of as science altogether. Science is not a one-to-one copying of the outside world. What he's going to say is that science is instead a creative, pragmatic interaction with that world, in which there might be further ways of doing things. And for Kuhn, this is obvious in a way it wouldn't have been for somebody 100 years before, right? Kuhn is somebody who's educated as a physicist. He starts to work in the history of science actually as a summer job, and starts to look at Aristotle and says, well, actually Aristotle was really smart, and people doing Aristotelian science were not stupid. And yes, they were displaced by Newton, but I'm trained to be a theoretical physicist, so I'm studying Einstein. So I know that Newton was displaced by Einstein. And that suggests to me that it could be that Einstein gets replaced by somebody else, that person gets replaced by somebody else. The process could keep going on and on. Science enters history. right? Science is not just sort of unveiling something that's always been there, it's a creative process that certainly reveals consistent truths. I don't think Kuhn, although he has some more extreme statements, I don't think he would disagree with that. But he would say those consistent truths can be understood differently in the same way as the Gestalt image can be understood differently. And in that way, he's going to say the image of science itself is the decisive transformation. Any questions about that? That then is going to be sort of what makes, if nothing else, I mean, if you don't want to do science, you want to write bestsellers, right? This is a good way of thinking about writing a bestseller. He's now explained to the scientist and the artist. So you want to be creative, you want to be the next Watson and Crick. I'm going to show you the ways these things happen. But with that, he's also introducing a change into essentially American and Western society of saying, we've always thought of science as something in which we got it right, and people in the past or people in other cultures did not. I'm instead going to show you a way of thinking about science where we're making very coherent, powerful connections in the world. And they're doing us a lot of good, but other people made very coherent and productive connections in the world as well. Right? The Polynesians had a far better system of navigation than anybody in Europe, from 1000 AD onwards. The Mayans had a better system of mathematics. And he's going to say it's not coincidental, because what they were doing, what they had worked quite well. Similarly, our science is one moment of this, and we need to look at this as a developmental process. That then is going to be sort of the basis of what he considers as the foundation of his paradigm shift. But he's going to say, for this reason, there's a couple of elements that go along with it. One will be that the concept of paradigm also means an example within the shift itself, right? That is, a paradigm shift happens because you have enough examples, enough sort of elements of that gestalt that then start to fall into place so that you can make sense of something and so that it has a meaning for you. Just as for instance, a famous side example of this, when Galileo first started to talk about the role of the tides being based on the moon and gravity, the church outlawed any reference to the tides. They say you talk about whatever else you want, but don't talk about the tides. Because every fisherman, everybody who lives near the sea, knows what tides are. And if they start looking at tides and thinking of your theory, and thinking of planets, and basically confusing our entire notion of the world, that's a problem. Those would be paradigmatic examples in Kuhn's case, right? This is what he would call a paradigmatic example. Similarly, for any given science, we'll say there's a number of paradigm examples that essentially cement people's way of looking at the world, right? It's a paradigm example that obviously the Earth is the center of the universe because we see the sun go up and down every day. And clearly it's circling us. That's a paradigm example. It sets in place a paradigm along with many, many other details in which you think it makes complete sense for the Earth to be the center of the world. And his point was to say all those examples will always have gaps. And the point of the scientist is to find the gaps in the present examples, right? For Einstein, it's finding gaps in the Newtonian theory by saying, okay, we're having a problem with electromagnetism. What if it's not, in fact, that the constant in the world is absolute time and space, but the constant in the world is light and the speed of light, right? That's changing your paradigm and changing your paradigm examples. Let me get a little bit further into then some of the examples of what happens to Kuhn when he starts to make this transition. And I think that will make the example a bit clearer. And then we'll talk a little bit more about what this would mean in terms of history in itself and of the influence that he's having on reality. As I mentioned, this model of the sort of gestalt form that switches becomes what he gets interested in. And he does this particularly when he's a grad student working on Aristotle. And I don't want to sort of bore anybody who doesn't have an interest in physics too much, but it's important to notice what he starts to pay attention to here, right? He's helping a physics professor at Harvard write a textbook. The guy says, look at a bunch of stuff on Aristotle. The longer he looks at that material, the more he says, Aristotelian physics is really, really smart and totally internally consistent. We might consider it wrong. It might not be as productive as our form of physics, but we have to say that it was science. This becomes his basic point, right? Again, the image of science. We shouldn't say it's a false science. We should say it's a different science that had different results. Among other things he notices right off is the average educated person in the 12th century or the 14th century reading Aristotle could look around the world and explain almost everything in the world. Right? There was literally an argumentative, rational explanation for almost everything we see. Think of that compared to our present circumstance, right? Even if I were to explain the wood in this lectern, I could start off by talking about cellulose, chemistry. Pretty quickly, though, I'd be getting into subatomic physics. I'd get really way out of my league. I'd start to not know exactly what I was talking about. This is true for almost everything in the world. The Aristotelian world had an immediate advantage in that it was a coherent whole to some extent. It had some very basic rules. One of the most famous was that there are different laws on the Earth than beyond the moon, right? Everything beyond the moon goes in circles. Everything on the Earth obeys its own rules of heading towards the center. It had another very basic and thus very silly sounding set of rules, claiming that each element went towards its desired location. Right? Earth falls to Earth. That's why if you have a rock and you drop it, it drops down. The Earth is the center of the universe. It's where all heavy things are heading. That's why they're all stuck here. Right? Fire rises up into the spheres, ultimately into the outer bounds of the universe. That becomes the celestial spheres. That's where heaven is. That's a lighter, airier, more fantastic place that we will never understand because our minds don't match that place. Right? You've already sort of settled a lot of big problems here, right? But within that, a lot of people, both in Greek times and monks and others working in the 11th, 12th, 13th century, came up with a lot of very clever arguments. And the more Kuhn looked at them, the more he said, it's science. We don't agree with it. It doesn't do all the things we want it to do. But for getting along in the world, it worked pretty well. And it worked pretty well for a very, very long period of time. He then started to look at some other examples. And I'll just give you one quick example. The concept of motion in Aristotelian physics. In Aristotelian physics, everything is in motion, like a rock that you drop. Because something else put it in motion or because it's trying to get to its natural spot. Right? The rock that you drop is getting to its natural spot. Everything else you see in the world is in motion because somebody put it in motion. And again, if you think about it, that's a pretty good explanation of motion. Right? Somebody throws a rock, animals moving, whatever's going on, it's all in motion because of some process that's setting it in motion. And this indeed becomes the basic tenet of Aristotelian physics. It's famously put in these two Latin terms, inclinatio ad quietem, all bodies inclined towards rest. And everybody, nobody can move unless a force is acting on it. Omne quod movitur, ali movitur, or aliquid movitur. Right? This is sort of the classics of the 12th century physics tradition. If you know any physics at all, you'll immediately notice it's exactly the opposite of what we think. Right? And Kuhn was really interested in this. He said, so they're saying that every body has to be moved by something. And that's the basic of their physics.